right, after that COP, in COP 22, which happened in Morocco, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there was something launched called the NDC Partnership. It was launched by different governments. In the lead was the German government, together with the host of the COP, the government of Morocco, and the World Resources Institute. And the basis for this partnership was to ensure that it's actually a coalition of member states. We have developed countries and developing countries, and we are to ensure that developing countries are able to develop their NDCs. That was the initial plan. Develop their NDCs, their commitments, and submit to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, including providing the support that is required for implementation of the NDCs. Then slowly, over the years, because by around 2019, 2020 towards now 2020 deadline, when we needed to update our NDCs, most of the countries had submitted the initial NDCs. So the phase 2, we call it a phase 2 of the partnership. We are looking at resource mobilization for different member countries so that they're able to translate these big commitments that we have submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change into actions that can be implemented at the national level, but also especially at the local level, and ensure that we have financing for those actions. So how do we work? This is a country-driven process. We have 3 components which are very important. Maybe you need to understand. One is country engagement, where we provide coordination for all stakeholders. So we look at a whole of government approach, both the vertical and horizontal coordination between ministries and between the 2 levels of government. And then we also make sure that we are aligning partners to the financing or to the priorities of the NDCs. So when partners are coming up with new projects and programs, we try and ensure that those projects and programs are within the scope of our NDC. In our country commitment, we have taken a very serious, ambitious target. We want to reduce 32%. Initially, in our initial NDC, it was 30% of emissions by 2030. That's translated to about 40 to 41 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. What that means is, if we do nothing, we don't mitigate, we don't evolve technology, we grow as a country. We are projected to get to 143 million tons of CO2 equivalent. But we say as a country, we are contributing, believe it or not, less than 0.1% of emissions. Less than 0.1% of the global emissions. It's negligent. And this is not just our situation, most countries in the South, but still, in the goodwill of the common good, for us to contribute to reduce our emissions further and say we will still grow, but we want to grow in a manner that is low, it's a low emissions, but ensuring that it's also a climate resilient growth trajectory. So we prioritize climate resiliency, but also we reduce our emissions using technologies and all that. We revised this contribution in 2020 when we updated the NDC to 32%. We need you media, and this is where you really come in. We need you to pick these targets and break them down into a narrative, a language that is easy to understand, that is able, we can relate to sectoral commitments. For instance, what does this mean to one of the most critical sectors, agriculture? In our country at the moment, agriculture is the biggest emitter of GHG emissions, greenhouse gases emissions, and this is because of the livestock. Methane has a very high global warming potential. So the more we are talking about livestock, we are talking about pastoralism, and it's a way of life for most of the communities. And these are the communities that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. What is the alternative? So these are the stories that I really like the discussion in the morning and the high level discussion and the presentations from Prof. And the PS and the remarks from Dr. Pacific as well. We need to break down this content in a way that scientists cannot. And then there was the whole discussion on expertise in sectoral sectoral expertise, for instance. Do you have energy expertise? Does it really matter? Maybe we need to discuss. There can be partnerships. And this is where I see a very big role for you. You can engage with energy institutions, and you get to bring out the data, you get to bring out the stories, you get to amplify our climate change impacts, but also not just focusing on the impacts. We are doing a lot as a country, and most of it from our national budget, because the financing that is coming into climate change is very limited, and it's flowing to those sectors that are easy to finance, that have a business case. So we have an avenue through the NDC partnership. The first one I talked about is country engagement, where we provide the coordination for the implementation of the NDC. We also support in that country engagement the reporting back. Under the National Climate Change Act of 2016 that has been amended in 2023, there are duties to different entities. Public entities have duties, private sector have duties, even civil society have duties. If you look at, I think now in section 20 from 24 or earlier, I don't know about the new amendments, the articles. But the duty is that for the ministries, departments, and agencies, for instance, they are mandated, they are required to report annually on progress of implementation of climate action. The same to private sector, the same to civil society. These duties, because as you're aware, we should be having a National Climate Change Council, which has not been, it has been established but has never had one meeting as yet because of different challenges. But this report should provide feedback to the Council on progress of implementation at national and local level of our NDC, but also our National Climate Change Action Plan. There was a question earlier that I really liked. It was about the Climate Change Act and how far we gone into implementing it. Since we launched the 2016 Climate Change Act, and by the way, we are one of the countries, I think it's the first country in Africa that has had a legislative focus on just climate change. This is very, very important because it has provided that visibility, but also even establishing a National Climate Change Council. How many councils do we have in the country? Anyone who knows? National councils. We only have one council that is chaired by the president, and that's the Security Council. This is the second council established by law that is to be chaired by the president. And this shows the significance of climate change in the country. The impacts of climate change to our economy cannot be overstated. And we usually talk of 3 to 5% impact to the economy, but this is a very outdated report. It was done in 2009 by the Stockholm Environment Institute. We need an updated review of the impacts of climate change. When you look at the locusts, for instance, the prolonged droughts, how does this impact the sectors and how does this impact the livelihoods at the local level? This is a study and a gap, for instance, that has been identified. But also we need you to tell us this information. Ask the government the questions so that this can be updated and can inform further policy development. On the second component, for the partnership, we foster engagement. Fostering engagement is in the National Climate Change Action Plan. This is a tool that is identified by the National Climate Change Act, 5-year iterative tool for implementing our NDC. We communicate globally that we want to reduce our emissions, but what does that mean locally? Ministry of Environment leads the development or coordinates the development of a National Climate Change Action Plan. We have had two action plans so far since 2018, and now we are in the third National Climate Change Action Plan. You remember during the Africa Climate Summit, there was a launch of the National Climate Change Action Plan. For the 5 years, this is a tool that you need to be presented to as media so that you can use to check government's action on climate change, because it's a requirement of the act that we implement this, but also, as I mentioned, there are duties to mainstream climate change action planning and report back on progress of implementation. we need to foster engagement with media, we need to foster engagement with private sector and civil society. There's an avenue, we usually coordinate meetings with development partners, and now I'm thinking there's even an avenue of engaging the media and bringing them to the discussion, to the table, of saying, providing that gatekeeping, and providing the checks and balances with government. So I see that as an opportunity for us through the partnership to engage with media. And then lastly, we have an avenue for knowledge and learning. You can check our NDC partnership online portal. There is a lot of content that is trying to break down the difficult lingua on climate change into simple languages. I can also share materials with the Kenya Editors Guild on climate change, on international negotiations, for those that are wanting to learn more, but also it can provide content for the curriculum that is going to be built. In our country, if you look at the history of climate change, when you talk about knowledge and learning, when I got into climate change, that was in 2012, is when I started. There were a few people like this who used to be in the climate change discussion, very few people. And it was mostly under this United Nations Framework Convention, this COPs. It was very, very few people who are in the COPs discussion, and towards the end of the year, you see there's a movement around climate change, and it was very, very difficult. If you're not a scientist in climate change, it used to be very difficult languages to understand, even just to understand the UNFCCC processes. How many have been to a COP, at least even one? What do you usually follow? Which track? You follow everything. Yes. Is there anyone who has specialized a track and then even if you consider they follow? For me, it's important that you follow everything, but sometimes following everything in COP can be following nothing. That's just the reality. When I went for my first COP, I felt like it was a marketplace. Because nobody tells you, this is the route to go, this is the interest, this you follow finance, you hear your president has gone to this. You see, Ghana has assigned event on, I don't know what you got. At the end of the day, you take stock, you have followed nothing. And this is also what needs to be broken down into climate change reporting. You need to specialize. If you want to focus on climate finance, that's a very big opportunity. Start learning on the climate financial discussion, especially from the international processes. The politics about that. What was promised by the developed countries? Where are we without targets? What are we demanding for? Ask the government, how much money have we received? From which sources? We have very different sources of financing. We have sources, maybe from governments, like the German government, Denmark, and all that. We have multinationals, and in world formats, you'll be very surprised that, for instance, the program we are talking about the financing of global action. This was a program that is designed to be a grant, a full grant, and a result. It went to Ghana and it came back as a loan. And the focus is to finance adaptation. These are the questions that we can be talking about. So, of the finances we received, which are the grants, which are, and where is the big sectors, where we are funding. So these are the questions that if you are a climate, if you want to be a climate finance reporter, these are the questions you can ask. Energy, agriculture, forestry, industry, waste, and manufacturing. The issues that are manufacturing are completely different from the issues in agriculture. The politics under agriculture, for instance, because there's a whole discussion on how do we ensure food security for countries that are developing and vulnerable to rain-fed agriculture, for instance, and balance that with reducing emissions from those same sectors. At the same time, you're talking about countries, developed countries who want to significantly cut emissions from the agriculture sector. They could afford to do that. Can we afford to do that? Can we say, for instance, we reduce the growth of livestock in the country? Livestock is providing not just food, but it's also providing significant jobs to a lot of communities. So those are the discussions. The issues in energy are very different. Where do we find financing for renewable energy? For instance, you go to South Africa, and I'm digressing a bit, but it's really important for you to understand that climate change reporting is really, really broad, and you have to specialize in a way. You might not be an expert, but you can get interested in a topic. You go to South Africa, there's a whole discussion on energy, just and equitable energy transition. As much as for us in Kenya, we have over 90, last year it dropped, we have about 89% of renewables in our grid. In South Africa, it's the reverse. It's, I think, about 90% is from fossil fuels, from coal. How do you tell a country that is still qualified as developing, how do you tell them to transition to green when they cannot even power their economy with the fossil fuels they have? So those are the questions, and they were able to package a very good deal for themselves, and they went to COP. This was COP 26, you remember? And they got a very big package from there, and at that whole discussion, they got money to finance their just an equitable energy transition. Mostly grants, but some of it also loans. So those are the questions. Media has a lot of, a big opportunity to even shape conversations nationally and internationally. Forestry issues, there was a question earlier around carbon markets. Let me shock you. As much as we have a big forestry target, we still have significant emissions from our forestry sector. How do we balance that with carbon markets? A lot of people are planting trees, but it's not just plant a tree and expect credits. There's a whole discussion on methodologies for forestry sector. Since we started carbon markets in the country, forget about this new regime of the Paris Agreement. Under the Kyoto Protocol, we had a previous regime. I mean, this is now, I get again into the whole lingua, but under the previous regime, before the Paris Agreement, we had the CDM. That was a market, a compliance market established for trading. And most of the projects we had in that regime, in Kenya, none of them actually is from the forestry sector, because of that whole discussion. So we need to look at what are the issues, how can we benefit as a country, and in which sectors we need to investigate. But at the same time, engage with government. And I was discussing earlier, I was hoping that government would be here to provide a presentation, to set the scene, to provide the legislations, to engage with you on carbon markets and where we are as a country. And then based on that, you can identify areas and gaps for reporting. But I really, really look forward to a very good deliberation. We are very open to through the NDC partnership. We receive requests through the government. So for instance, if there is a need to engage with media and amplify or talk about climate positive reporting in the country, we can receive a request from a media organization or through an association for media through the focal points, which is the Ministry of Environment. Dr. Pacifica is our focal point, and it goes to the partnership. The partnership sends this to all partners under the partnership. Right now we have over 124 partners, both developed countries, implementing agencies, international organizations, and that request then we look for funding. Then through that we give again response to the government and say we have funding for this, and we support this. It can be either direct funding or the partner that is providing the funding engages with the institution that is providing the request to implement. So I think there are many ways of fostering engagement, and members of the fourth estate, there is a lot of power when it comes to climate change. It's just about enhancing capacities, providing skills, but also specialization to know how to tell these stories. When I was listening to Prof earlier, he was actually storytelling. For me, it was very interesting because he was reviewing all the issues that are there around reporting in a way that is easy to understand. And this is a power that you have, a gift that you have that scientists might not have. So there's need for partnership so that we can provide visibility and enhance the resilience of our communities as the end goal. Thank you. Thank you. Now we go back to the regulations. I'm sorry. The CDM is so under the Kyoto Protocol, it was set differently. and that's why it needed to be reviewed. Developed countries had targets to reduce their emissions, but developing countries did not have targets. Under that framework, each of the developed countries have targets. They created a clean development mechanism. It's like a compliance market for engaging. If you're able to supersede, and this is how carbon markets works. If, for instance, you have a carbon emission reduction target, and you exceed your target, that means you have excess emissions, you're able to trade, you're able to sell to another country that does not meet their targets. So it's a compliance market that is governed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that enables the trading of credits between different countries. But it was mostly to enable the developed countries to also get credits from developing countries because their targets were very stringent. Yet developing countries had opportunities for reducing emissions, and they did not have targets, so that they could sell credits to the developed countries. The whole Kyoto Protocol failed in a way because most developed countries felt that developing countries also needed to be part of the discussion. And that is why in the Paris Agreement, it's all parties under the United Nations Framework Convention are bound to reducing emissions.
Thank you very much.